I was interested by what was going on in California, and that was with Raymond Moody, and it was near-death experiences. And I said to myself, rubbish, absolute rubbish. I suppose it must have been about a month later, into my consulting room, walked a man in great distress because he had just had a failed cardiac catheter and a near-death experience. Somebody noticed that our husband was getting all his affairs in order, packing up and everything. When she asked him what he was doing, he said, "Well, I think I'm going to die soon." Then you'll probably have deathbed visitors. They are usually relatives, like your dead mum, your dead brother, your dead sister, something like that. And they will come and chat to you.
Kia ora, hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. We are in season 13, talking all about end-of-life experiences. So what the patient may experience, what those around the patient may experience. And today we have an expert in this field. I am delighted for the conversation that we're going to have today. Today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Fenwick, who is a neuropsychiatrist and world-renowned expert in end-of-life phenomena, including near-death experiences and deathbed visions. He is a graduate of Trinity College in Cambridge and is a senior lecturer at King's College in London, where he also worked as a consultant at the Institute of Psychiatry. Dr. Fenwick's research looks into deathbed visions of the dying person, as well as the experiences of hospice and palliative care workers and relatives of the dying people. Along with Elizabeth Fenwick, Peter is author of multiple books, the latest being The Art of Dying, which helps the dying, their loved ones, and healthcare workers better understand the dying process and to come to terms with death itself. So Dr. Peter Fenwick, thank you so much for joining me for a conversation today. Welcome along to Let's Talk Near Death.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here.
Now, you're one of the leading experts in end-of-life phenomena and understanding what might happen at the end of life. Where do we begin the conversation? How did you get to being a researcher in this field?
Well, you might well ask. It all started when I was fairly young, I suppose 40, and I was interested by what was going on in California, and that was with Raymond Moody, and it was near-death experiences. And I said to myself, rubbish, absolute rubbish. They happen in California. They'll never cross the Atlantic. And then to challenge that, I suppose it must have been about a month later, into my consulting room, walked a man in great distress because he had just had a failed cardiac catheter and a near-death experience. Now, after that, it was quite clear to me that these things occur in England and haven't been properly studied. So I set out to look at the near-death experience. And if you look at the near-death experience, you say to yourself, well, perhaps the near-death experience says something about the dying process. Now, you won't believe this, but when I went to the medical literature to look at the dying process, there must have been about 2 or 3 or 4 papers only. So you could be a world expert overnight in that field. So I thought probably the next thing to do is to do some work on this and see what actually happens. And so I set out to look at dying itself.
And so you found out that these things do actually happen in the UK, not just in America. Back then, how were you able to do your research? How were you able to find out some answers and understand what the dying process might be like?
What I did, I was very fortunate. I put in for a grant application. I think it was to the BL Foundation. And I was given it, which gave me enough money to employ 2 palliative care nurses, and they then went around the hospices asking questions. But because this was a relatively new field, when I put in for ethics approval and said I wanted to talk to the dying and find out the actual process, they said no. It's too soon. You may disturb the dying, but what you can do is a carer study. And that was brilliant in retrospect, because the people who know what's going on in the dying process, not so much the dying themselves, but the carers, they see it all. And so it was a very good place to start learning about how we die and the phenomena which occur before, after, and during death.
And were they quite open to helping you with that?
The first hospice I went to and said I want to look at the experiences around dying, they said, absolutely not.
Oh, really?
We know we don't have any of those experiences here. And as I was sort of rather disappointed in going out, the nurses said, he's totally wrong. He just doesn't know. And so that gave me a lot of energy to go to the next hospice, who welcomed us in. And so we were able to ask questions of the nursing population.
Yeah. Gosh, wow. I think it's something that can be very difficult to talk about, can't it? It's a very personal thing.
It shouldn't have been, because we're all going to go through it.
I know.
In fact,
100% death rate. Yes. Exactly. Which is why I feel so passionate that we need to open the conversation, because in a way, it's like the elephant in the room, which doesn't make it an easy conversation. It doesn't mean there's no pain associated, because grief is very real, loss is very real, but 100% hit rate on death, we're all going to die. I think we need to talk about it.
Yep. And if I do this, tell your listeners that they're going to die, I've done something rather wicked there, because this will fire up their existential fear of death. Now, there's been quite a lot of research into this. And when your existential fear of death is operating, you change your behavior. Now, I'll give you one of the examples from their study. What they did is they took judges, okay? They took two populations, gave them a questionnaire to make sure that both groups had the same personalities, etc. And in one group, they added the question, how long will it be before you die? Okay? That means that they got one group who had their existential fear of death raised, and the other didn't. Were these the same? So they gave the judges a case to judge, and it was, I think it was a prostitute. What would they do with her? And the judges knew perfectly well the fine was about $50. So the first group, who had not had the question, were asked, and they said, well, it wasn't really a very serious transgression. Perhaps you shouldn't have done it, $50. Now, the other group were quite different. They said it was the most abominable thing to have done, and they charged her 9 times as much, $450. This was the only difference between the groups, was the existential fear of death. Now, when we think about death, we must keep this in mind, because if I go into a room and say, hey guys, you're all going to die, all around me, the existential fear of death will be triggered, and people's behavior will change. They will, in fact, not sit close to me. They won't be very keen to talk to me.
Oh, gosh.
So our behavior is really very poor. And this is because I think, in fact, we're not exposed to death at all. Now, if you go to Bhutan, where I've never been. So this is just my reading of it. Beautiful country, just near the Himalayas. And there they have a lot of Buddhists and other religions, but Buddhists predominantly. And there is no fear of death at all. Absolutely no fear of death. They talk about it. It's in all their monuments and figures, and it's a normal thing. And they don't have this existential fear of death. So what you're doing here is lowering the general level of the existential fear of death, and that's brilliant.
Oh, thank you. I really hope so. I hope it makes a difference. And I can resonate with what you're saying there, because I think if we try and protect our young people from death, which is something that happens quite often, young people are excluded from visiting loved ones who are really unwell or sick, or they're not included in funeral ceremonies, things like that. If we try and protect them by creating distance between life and death, I'm not sure that's doing any favors for us. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just think the more we can talk about it, the better it can be, and try and make it quite open, because like you're saying, when it's an open part of life, there's not so much fear. The fear's diminished, and there's a lot more acceptance of the fact that 100% of us are going to die. Yeah.
And the behavior also changes. I think that this is really quite important. I mean, your point of protecting children is pointless. Look, have you ever had a hamster? Ever had a cat or something kill a hamster? There's death straight away. What is it? What's happened to the hamster? And then, of course, Granny will die. What's going to happen to Granny? She's going to be put in a wooden box. It all wants to be normalized. There's nothing terrible about it. It's just the way things are.
And normalized is such a good word to use, I think. Making it everyday, making it normal. I think part of the conversation, Peter, is possibly around consciousness. When we look at death and we have an understanding of consciousness and what may be beyond this world, beyond this reality, perhaps that can shape our views and reduce the fear as well. So I know the big question that we have for you, for all your years of research, we're going to come on in and ask you for the punchline, I suppose, is what do you think happens, or what does your research lead you to believe that happens in those moments of death?
Okay, I'll do that. But just before I do that, I want to say that the whole field of immediately after death experiences has changed. And this is due to a man called Bigelow. He's a billionaire and lives in the States and builds rockets and is interested in UFOs and things. But he gave a £500,000 as the first prize, 250 as the second, 100 as the third, and then there were 9 other prizes on people who could write scientific essays on what happens after life. And these essays were all put in, and it was Jeffrey Mishlove, who in fact won the first prize. Then a man called Pim van Lommel won the second, and the third one went to an Englishman. And there were some essays which were so good that although they weren't in the first 9, they could not be rewarded. So they should be rewarded. And fortunately, ours was one of those. And so we got $20,000 for our group.
Oh, fantastic.
And what it means is that we now have an understanding of after death, seen scientifically from some of the best researchers throughout the world. And it's quite clear that what we have been working with is a science which is a reductionist science. Okay, nothing wrong with that. It treats the world as things, nothing wrong with that. things like spiritual life and so on clearly are just a brain phenomena, a lot wrong with that. And so we're limited by the sorts of questions we can ask. But now, with the data and also the advent of quantum mechanics, the idea of non-locality, where things can, go from one place to another without actually being transported in a consciousness field, are what's important. And so we have the dying process in which we no longer necessarily think that it's just the brain that dies. And the idea that there is a central spiritual core which continues is there in the scientific literature, which is not reductionist, but is non-reductionist. So it's very good. It's part of the new science.
Exactly. And that's fantastic, isn't it, to have such research? It's brilliant. What do you think happens? Is there some themes? Is there some common ground with what people believe happens from a scientific perspective?
Yes, absolutely. A lot which is common. Firstly, I think you should probably go back to the dying process so we can see it. Remember, I came to this because of near-death experiences, and I was asking, are near-death experiences a prelude to the dying experience? Well, do you know when you're going to die? Some people do. They get premonitions that they're going to die. We've got some nice accounts of premonitions. Somebody noticed that her husband was getting all his affairs in order, packing up and everything. When she asked him what he was doing, he said, well, I think I'm going to die soon. And there was no reason. He's perfectly healthy. But in fact, his firm asked him to go in a small aeroplane in Africa to do something, and it crashed and he was killed. So that was really quite a good premonition. Now, we got other premonitions, some of which can be very short term, like a woman who dreamt a really horrid dream that her daughter was run over. And it was a very real dream. And when she woke up, she knew that her daughter was dead because she'd seen it in the dream. But then she found that her daughter, in fact, was in bed beside her because she'd obviously come in the night for reassurance of some sort. And so the mother was very relieved. Then 2 days later, she was struck by a car and killed.
Oh, my goodness.
So there are premonitions like that. There's some very long-term premonitions, and people give accounts of these. One boy told his mother was chatting to him when he's about 4 about what his life was going to be like, and as mothers will do, and then you'll go to university and things like that. And he said, I won't be here, don't you? And she said, of course you'll be here. But of course that stayed with her. And in his late teens, he was in fact run over and killed. So he never, in fact, was able to go through that part of his life. So he had foreknowledge of when his death was. Most of us don't. Most of us don't get premonitions, but they are out there. So we can come on to the actual death process itself. When are we going to consider it starts? Well, it's an arbitrary figure. I take about a fortnight. And it starts with, you're probably in a hospice. I hope you will be. Or at home, being nursed by a rather fraught wife. But with any luck, certainly in the UK, you can get help from the local palliative care nurse. And then you'll probably have deathbed visitors. These are fascinating. They are usually relatives, like your dead mum, your dead brother, your dead sister, something like that. And they will come and chat to you. They're perfectly real to you. and you can even feel them sitting on the bed. And why do they sit on the bed? Because it's very reassuring to the person who's dying. I mean, if a child is ill, we always sit on their bed and hold their hands. And so the deathbed visions do more or less the same thing. Do they just appear in the room? Yes and no. Sometimes they'll appear outside and then in the corridor and then come in. Sometimes they will just appear in the room. It varies quite a bit. And what do? Well, they talk to you and reassure you. And are they always family members? No, because we have accounts of a whole battalion. Well, not really a whole battalion, but a large number of soldiers who came to wish one of their comrades who was dying well through the dying process. And they were part of a group of his in the war that got killed. And so it doesn't have to be your own relatives. It can, in fact, be people who know you and probably know you quite well. So that's the first stage. Now, you have to remember that and you've got to remember this when you guys are dying, that is that the dying process is sometimes set by a deathbed relative. Will come in and say, well, I'll be coming back on Tuesday and then we can go together. What? And and now it's only Friday. And you say, Tuesday, I don't want to die then because my son's coming over from New Zealand. And they will say, okay, well, then we'll make it Friday of next week. So you can negotiate a bit. But if you say there's a fantastic hospice party on that day, they won't change it for you. But if as you enter the dying process and you're given a date, if it's not suitable, you can negotiate, usually with the deathbed vision, to change it for you. So these are the deathbed visions. And as I say, think of them starting a fortnight before, something like that. And then we come to a time which is much closer to death. And this is totally fascinating. And that is when you leave the hospice, spiritually, of course, or in consciousness, and go to a different realm. And this realm is full of light and love, angelic-like figures or spiritual figures, and one or two of your relatives. And they will be there. And it's as if it's a sort of waiting place for what's going to happen so that you can get used to it. And so you'll go up to this waiting place, and then you'll go back again to your hospice bed. And then you may go again. So it may be one or two trips there before you actually come to death itself. So in a sense, you're being prepared. Now, there is something called terminal lucidity, which I always thought should be investigated by science, because this is when the dying person suddenly becomes fully conscious, awake, can move, and greets the relatives and says goodbye to them. Now, all those things becomes fully conscious. They may have been in coma for 2 or 3 months. They may have been demented, not able to say anything, recognize anybody. They may have been paralyzed down one side, but yet all this just before death changes. And we need a good scientific study, but I'm so pleased that now at long last, there are a number of people who are setting out to look at terminal lucidity, both in children and adults. But it's a fascinating thing. How can this happen? If it's just the brain which does it all, then there's no explanation. But if you think of consciousness as existing beyond the brain, then certainly one can see that this might happen. But it's the apparent healing also, which is surprising. It's what the Victorians called lightening up before death. So that's
amazing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And then you actually go into the death process itself. Now, I think probably one of the best workers in this field is Monica Renz. She is a palliative care theologian. She's in Zurich, and she's done 2 amazing studies with about 40 people who were dying. So it's not a trivial study. And what she found is that as you come up to death, you go through 3 phases. The first one she calls, this is 2 or 3 days before you actually die, pre-transition. And then again, closer to death, transition, and then post-transition. It's just worth looking at these stages because you can see them all in the dying. Pre-transition is as you actually approach death, you realize that you're dying, you realize that you're not going to go back anywhere, and that the only place is forward. And so you have to let go of everything. Let go of your children, go of your house, let go of your position in society, let go of your bonds with your wife, everything. And so it's a clearing or cleaning, and it's very profound, and you've got to go through this. If you don't, then you end up saying, well, I'm not really dying, actually. Yes, you are. And you get very anxious because you know you are at one level, and yet you're not admitting it to yourself. So that gives you a very anxious, laden death process. So don't do it. Give up everything and face the future with curiosity. In Monica Renz's series, those people who are curious, in fact, probably suffered a lot less than others. The ones who suffered least were those who'd had near-death experiences because they accepted the whole process and were sort of looking forward to it in a way because they knew all about it. But that's not a bad stance to have. You're going to go through it, accept it. And so this is then in pre-transition. You can either go the anxiety, awfulness route, or you can go the, okay, this is how it is. Let's bring the show on. It's not a bad attitude. So curiosity, be curious. God, what's going to happen next? Where are we? That sort of thing. Then you come to transition. Transition is a difficult time because you're now losing most of your egoic structures. Ego, yes. Your feeling of I, and you're beginning to dissolve a bit. And some people get very upset with that. Don't. It's just part of the process. Then you come through that before you die into post-transition. And here you enter the sort of realm which we were talking about before, the spiritual realm with spiritual figures. And from there, you die, and then you go on. And that's when actual observation of the dead people of the dying people has to end, because obviously they're dead at that point. So you then go on to the scientific literature, and you say, oh, well, of course, it's only a piece of meat, and it's just deteriorated, and it's all in the brain. But the scientific evidence is so weighty now. I'd like all the hospices that you go to get a copy of the Bigelow papers and leave them lying about the hospice, because they are very, very encouraging. And they show that consciousness extends beyond death. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And not only that, uh, they are the most wonderful descriptions of this. Um, uh, mediums. Let's take mediums. Well, if you go back to the old literature, sort of 1900, 1800s, seances were very common. And the mediums would generate ectoplasm. Sometimes ectoplasm would take the form of a person who had died and who would give you advice of various sort and speak to you. So what you do is, they said, well, this ectoplasm, it looks real, but of course you can't touch it because the medium won't let you do that. So what they did, and if this is such a neat experiment, they got molten wax, not too hot so as to burn the ectoplasmic figure, but just enough to keep it molten. And they asked if an ectoplasm person, spirit person, don't know, no good word for it, to put their hand into the molten wax and then take it out again. And of course, if it was real, in the sense that it was in some sense physical, then the wax would stick to the hand. And so they tried to get the person, if it was a person, to put their hands into the wax. And at the end of this, then of course the ectoplasm withdrew, and the question is, what happened to the wax which was on their hand? And the answer was, it left a perfect cast of their hands. And so you could fill that with plaster of Paris, and you had then a most or some agent, and you had a perfect cast of what the ectoplasm's hand was like. I mean, it's an amazing experiment, isn't it?
That's incredible, isn't it? I wonder whether anybody would be able to recognize a hand, or, because our hands are all different.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be amazing if you had that experience and you could capture that and then take it home, have a plaster of Paris hand of your past loved one? I don't know. I'm going down a track there. I just think that's absolutely incredible. Wow.
And of course, everybody said rubbish. This was done, it was falsified. And so what one person did, so nobody knew this, put dye in the wax. And so if it was from outside and imported into the seance, then say it wasn't real, they would know immediately. But no, the wax color was found in the mold. So, I mean, the evidence that it was a real happening is good. So these are the sorts of things that you have to do. And then you come to after death experiences. The moment of death, you get what are called deathbed coincidences. And this is when the dying person goes to talk to somebody who they're closely attached to. One of the stories I like best, but they're all very similar, is a mother whose son is in the UK and she's in Australia. And she has a dream. And in the dream, she sees her son coming towards her. And he's dripping wet. As he comes towards her, he transfigures and becomes covered in white light in the transfiguration process, says to his mum, "I'm okay, please don't worry," and then vanishes. And she knew that he had died. And so she rang up when the people in England were awake, and found out that, in fact, he'd been sailing, and just at that time, he had drowned. And it was interesting how the wet clothes were carried into her dream of his drowning. So it was really interesting. But at any rate, he went to see her. And the message that all deathbed coincidences give, don't worry, I'm okay.
I'm okay.
And there are
exactly.
quite a large number of those stories. So deathbed coincidences is the final story of the person, because they then disappear from this world, quote unquote.
Yeah.
What we should talk about is the phenomena which occur in the hospice room. Now, there are a number of phenomena. They don't always occur, but ask the carers, like we did, of the dying, and they're seen sometimes. One is light in the room. Fascinating. Some people describe it as a small light, like a candle, but not a candle. Other people describe it as a source of white light. Now, what is fascinating about this is that I suspect if you took a photometer in there or a camera, that you, in fact, probably wouldn't see anything, because some people of the relatives see it and others don't. Some carers can see it and some don't. So there's obviously a sensitivity thing here of some sort. So light in the room, animals at home will become disturbed as you die. Cats do respond. Dogs howl at the moment of death. And then you get cats, dogs, light. Those are the commonest ones. You can get birds coming in to the room. They come to the window. I'd love to do a test of this. Just put a camera outside, excuse me, a hospice window, and see if birds really come. Nice, simple experiment. But anyway, it said they do. And they also afterwards, the people who report that birds will come in, a bird will come into the house, walk past the cat who ignores it, into the room where it will stay for a bit and then go. And they say, I know that's my dead husband or whatever. Now, goodness knows whether it is or not. The fact that the cat doesn't see it makes me wonder if it isn't just within her and not within in the real world. You know, it's rather like the light in the room, which some people see and some people don't. So some people see birds and some people don't. It may be a sensitivity thing. And then you come to after-death communications. And there's been a lot of work done recently on that. They are extremely common. This field was opened up by a man called Dewey Reese in an article in the BMJ. And he talked about people who came into his surgery, because he was a GP, and talked about seeing their dead husbands or wives. And now, of course, there have been international surveys on this. And it is so common. It's almost into the 90% of people who have suffered a recent death. They may get an after-death communication from the dead person. Now, the usual explanation of that is, well, they would, wouldn't they? If you look at it, it's not quite like that. You'll get a husband who wakes up and knows that his wife is lying in bed beside him, because he can feel her and everything. And of course, the answer to that is, well, it's his brain making her up and putting her there for him. It seems not to be that. Then you get the after-death communication where somebody will, they will see people outside. And some people have these which go on for a long while. And they'll have long discussions with their dead spouse. And it will sort of occur every day. And they will be very reassured by this and helped by it. And they know perfectly well it is. In fact, they will then sometimes start using their dead spouse as a sounding board. Should I do this? Should I do that? Etc. So this is all part of that field. Is it real? Well, ask the people who experience it. They say yes. Can we account for it with reductionist science? Absolutely not, because nothing occurs outside the brain. Can we account for it with our new modern wider science? Easily, because this is where one is talking about quantum mechanics, one's talking about superimposed possibilities or probabilities, and the whole field changes because non-local communication is what happens. Now, non-local communication is fascinating because it means that you get communication across space and time with no real mechanism by which it'll happen, except in the sort of quantum explanations. And there is the Global Consciousness Project, which is putting random number generators throughout the world and to see what happens when there are big shifts in consciousness in the population. Twin Towers falling, it was widely disturbed the generators. O.J. Simpson trial, when everybody was waiting to know what the verdict was, again throughout the world, disturbed the senses. I was just wondering whether with Queen's death might disturb the senses too. But
yes,
I actually
very interesting.
know the guy, and so I can ask that. And then we, yes, and then we come to the fact that we're looking at consciousness now and random number generators. And so a group of us felt that if this was true, that random number generators can be affected so widely in different parts of the world with major happenings, what about hospices? When somebody dies, shouldn't that do it? Well, the answer is don't know, but probably. And we're very fortunate because a colleague and I have been just starting the process of examining this in one of the hospices in Scotland and in Spain in an intensive care unit that being put. The ones in the intensive care unit do show a marked change when the person dies. And the first data, which is coming back from the hospice in Scotland, where there'd been, I think, 6 deaths, also showed that. So you have to think that death is not a local phenomenon. It carries non-local components as well. So that's very exciting too.
It is.
That's the sort of cutting edge of death work, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, gosh. Peter, thank you so much. That is so interesting. I had a lot of questions while you were talking and a lot of avenues we could have gone, but I actually just wanted to sit here and see what came out, what you would share with us. And I just want to say thank you because there was so much in that and it's so incredibly interesting. I do, however, like always, have some questions. I find it fascinating listening to you and hearing you. You said quite some time ago now that perhaps we have a choice, and when somebody has a visit and maybe they come in and it's a spiritual visit and they say, well, I'll come back for you on Tuesday, and you say, well, my brother's flying out, can we make it Friday? It really starts to make me question how much choice we have in everything within life, within death, whether we can choose the people that are coming to greet us or to meet us. I have had some people share with me examples where there's been visitors that have come, spiritual visitors, and they have known who they are, but they weren't somebody that that they knew within their lifetime. Do you think we've got any element of choosing who our welcoming team will be, what our death experience will be like?
I have no doubt that we do. And the reason for that is that in the stories which have been told, usually there is a close emotional bond between the person and the deathbed visitor. Now, you've raised another interesting point there, but supposing it's not this lifetime, wow, now there's a can of worms for you.
Sure is. Boom.
Because what about the afterlife, all that sort of thing? But as I say, with the Bigelow data now, the presence or the possibilities of an afterlife is well in the scientific literature, even though I think Wikipedia and other reductionist sites will say rubbish. But in actual fact, if you actually look at the data, it's not, and particularly if you look at the papers, and it might be worth just noting that Bigelow is going to send out the winning essays and the specially mentioned essays in a compendium of books, and so it might be worthwhile getting some New Zealand hospices to write to him and just getting this data and leave it lying around for people to read. It's very persuasive.
Oh, gosh, I would love to have a look at that. Absolutely would love that. Yes, very valid point. When we talk about visitors coming, spiritual visitors who perhaps we don't know from this lifetime, for me, it opens up the opportunity to think about past lives and reincarnation, and were they our significant other in a previous lifetime, but we were at different timing in this lifetime, and it really makes me start to think. So I've been questioning how much choice we have, because some of the other guests that have been on this season have been talking about how patients might wait for the opportune moment to die. So the moment of transition, perhaps they wait for everybody to leave the room, or they wait for Uncle Jimmy to arrive after flying across the world, or whatever scenario it may be. But here you've actually blown my mind saying, well, Tuesday's not a good day. Can we make it Friday? That's incredible. And that they might do that. And then we hear within near-death experiences as well, people being given a choice. Do you want to go back? You can stay or you can go back. And it all taps into the same thing with this amount of choice that we have. It's amazing.
And we have to think about the amount of choice we have in terms of the sort of death process we want. If you take Monica Rentz's data on this, people who have had experience of death, near-death experiences, 90% of them had no anxiety. People who meditate have less anxiety. And there is this group that has less anxiety who are curious. And so curiosity is enormously important. So as you go into the hospital, say, yeah, I'm going to remain curious. Well, you can't be curious and be afraid, because the fear will trump the curiosity. So keep your curiosity going and you won't be afraid. And it's okay. What's going to happen now, eh?
What's next? I love that. And I think that's how we should be in life as well. I often talk about how I ask a lot of questions and I'm a bit skeptical in things, which I loved where you started out by saying that you didn't quite believe any of this, and then look where it's gone to now. So I love that. But if we can be curious in life as well, life and death, I think it's the way to go. Definitely. Do you think that everybody goes through the same experience? You've talked about these different phases that people have. Do you think it's the same for everyone?
I haven't found an example of people who don't. Let's just for a moment think of a group that clearly aren't going to go through the sorts of processes that I've described, which sort of start a fortnight before. And they're the sudden death in accident group.
Right, yeah.
And that group are different, and they seem to be disorientated because people report afterwards that they may have experience of particularly first responders, they may have experience of somebody who's died in the accident, a disincarnate person, who is very lost and doesn't know what's happened. And of course, there is battlefield data which suggests that people who are shot on the battlefield don't know that they've died, and so go on marching towards the enemy's lines, even though they are in fact dead. So there are a number of stories that sudden death is a different group. I think it's much nicer if you can arrange to die in a hospice rather than a car accident.
Yeah.
But the question is this foreshadowed? Do we have the choice to choose how we die?
Yeah.
What about suicide, you see?
Yeah. What do you think there?
I've had about 2 or 3 people who committed serious suicide, wanted to die and started the process of dying. And 1 or 2 people who've actually managed to get their heart stopped in the death process and then come back. And none of them would do it again because they realized that the life they were given here, they have lessons to learn. And you don't get it by taking a shortcut out. So when you start thinking about these things, you go right way off into philosophy of various kinds and religious experience too.
What about, we've talked about positive end-of-life experiences where we're seeing past loved ones, we've got light angels, what would seemingly be quite a beautiful experience. What about negative experiences? Do people experience darkness or unwelcome entities or things like that? Or is it all mostly positive, what you've researched?
The accounts that people give are positive ones. In other words, there is this spiritual loving light always which comes in. What about the old guy with the scythe who comes in dressed in black clothes and stands at the end of the bed? I'm waiting for you.
Do people see that?
No accounts of that at all.
None.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gosh,
none.
And that's what we see, isn't it? All the time we see this image, this perception of that, of death. Yeah, with the hood and
there's a nice story from a Canadian hospice which I like. Sometimes people go into hospices and their families never visit and they're all alone. And so the dying process is quite difficult. And one of the nurses told me this story, that she was there and her patient was feeling very lonely and abandoned. And she said, well, has anybody come to visit you? And she said, yes, Mary has come. Mary was an old friend of hers who died. And she said, well, Mary will look after you. So next time Mary comes, what you can do is you can go with her. And so she would, in the morning when she went in to wake up the patients, etc., she'd say to this one, has Mary come yet? And the answer was no. And then one day she said, the patient, Mary will be here tomorrow. She said, okay, go with her. She went and died.
Wow. Oh, it gives me goosebumps, quite literally. It's beautiful though, isn't it? Isn't it beautiful? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
So all of these experiences tend to be positive. I'm often asked the question, how many times do you think people have a near-death experience right before their actual death where they don't come back?
Well, I think it's all on the same continuum, really. If you say a near-death experience, that's really the transcendent part, going into love and light. I mean, you go down the tunnel meet the being of light, go into the English country garden, not New Zealand country garden,
Funny.
and walk about and meet your dead relatives there.
Mm,
You see fragments of this in the dying process. The idea of going into an area where there's spiritual figures and light and love, that
mm,
occurs in the dying process. That's part of the near death.
mm,
And do people go down tunnels? You see, I haven't uh, in what is reported, people don't report going down tunnels like they do in the near death experience.
mm,
And of course, a negative near death experience is one where usually you're floating in blackness, which is very scary.
mm,
If you're scared by floating in blackness, if you're not, it's not scary, which again is interesting.
mm.
So if you're curious about all this floating in blackness stuff, you'll probably be okay.
Yeah.
But if you're frightened by it, then it'll be very negative for you.
Mm,
So I think the answer to your question is yes, elements of the near-death experience occur in ordinary deaths, but you don't usually get them set out in the formal way that we've come to expect in near-death experiences. But that, again, is a compilation of many of them, and not all of them show it.
mm. I wonder as well if the patient or the person dying, I'm calling them the patient, may not make enough of a recovery to actually be able to communicate any type of near-death experience. Because from what I understand, it's almost like a veil that you go in and out, back and forth before the event takes place. So in a way, that is a near-death experience, but perhaps they don't become quite awake enough or able to communicate that. I find
Yes, or if they
terminal
are,
lucidity interesting because maybe in that
yes.
situation they would.
Yes. Interesting question. If you have terminal lucidity, do you talk about near-death experiences? No, you don't on the whole, because you've come
Mm,
back into the world and then you
mm,
go and
yeah,
then come back.
fascinating, isn't it? I had an experience with my grandmother actually. We were over in the UK and she was on her deathbed and the whole family had been called in. So my father had flown out from New Zealand. I was living there at the time. And she woke up and she was vibrant. She was full of energy. And it was very, very hard for us to understand why she was there. How could they be telling us she was so unwell and that she was going to die? And then she piped up and said she wanted a roast meal with all the trimmings. And we were trying to organize that for her. And she died within 24 hours. So
Absolutely.
it was a
24 to
classic
48
case
hours.
of that. Mm.
Yes.
So I don't know. It's
So we
amazing how
need to
often it
understand
happens.
that.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, I
Yes,
didn't
it
at the
is.
time. Mm.
Yeah.
How can we support somebody who's at end of life? What do you think we can do if somebody's having these experiences and they're saying they're seeing Uncle Jimmy in the room or there's something going on, they're seeing light or angels? How can we support people?
Just be with it. It's their experience, not yours. It's not up to you to see whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
Oh, ignore all those silly little angels.
Oh, it's a bit tough, isn't it? Do you think that medical staff are quite open to these experiences now? Are palliative
It,
care nurses aware of these things?
um, the palliative care staff are, because they deal with it on a daily basis. The hospital staff don't come
Mm.
across it so much. And
Oh, gosh.
something interesting, and that is that when do you take the dead body away to the mortuary?
Mm.
Um, and people who have sat with their relatives after they've died come across a phenomenon which is interesting, and that is that there appears to be a time when the soul, whatever else you like to call it, leaves the body. The essence, if you like, of the person leaves the body. And um, sometimes there's a cold wind, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it just, one moment they're there, it's there, they're there, and the next moment it's gone. And the suggestion is that you shouldn't move the body until it's empty, which is a very difficult concept for reductionist science. You can't get that one, really.
That's quite tricky.
So you have to ask the relatives, because they're the ones who can give you the answer to that. Is she in there still? We don't usually say that, because this is so counterculture. But nevertheless, it's real. So you don't want to pop the body into a mortuary when the person is still in it. It's really quite interesting. So this happens in hospices, but not in hospitals, because the sooner they get you out of the ward and into the mortuary, the better.
It's all about time, isn't it? It's so interesting how the environment might play a big part in the way that the end of life takes place, that the experience that the dying person might have. Very fascinating. I haven't thought about that.
Yes.
Now, I've got a little snippet out of your book, The Art of Dying, and this is a story which is told by a lady called Sue. And she says, "When my mother died, I experienced something leave with her last breath. It was for me quite a spiritual encounter. For several days after, I also felt something intangible but very real leave me. Yet at the same time, I experienced a sense of my mother's essence settling into me. It felt uncomfortable and disconcerting, and it was a couple of weeks before I felt like me again. In the long term, I realized that I had absorbed something of my mother's spirit and that she continues to live within me." Is this similar to what you're talking about understanding whether the spirit's still in the body? Because people would be asking, where does the spirit go? Other than heaven or whatever our belief system might say.
Yes. It's not common that, but with the commonness of after-death communication, it seems as if they're around for a long while, many months. They'll be chatting to you and talking to you and so on. The actual entering of the essence into your body is, in my experience, quite unusual. So that's why that particular story is an interesting one. But I mean, what's the difference between that story and waking up in the morning to find that your wife is in bed with you still?
Exactly. It's very similar. Like, it's a completely different experience, but a similar spiritual encounter, isn't it? So
yes.
Yeah. Oh, I find it fascinating. The more I talk, the more I question, which I think is interesting, and the more curious I get. So I really want to thank you for that, Peter. I so appreciate your time. I know our listeners will greatly appreciate your time and the conversation and just the amount of interesting science-based information you've given us today, as well as personal stories, as well as encounters from your own research. So I'm so grateful for you, Peter. So Dr. Peter Fenwick, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kirsty, for having me on. It's a great pleasure.